Hey everybody, this is PD from the Spinner Rack, and we also have,
Calvin Ellis, ready to rock.
well, today we got some requests. At this point, we're only doing one of the requests right now. We are doing our oral history on Mort Weisinger. Do you have any first things to say about this, since you're a Superman expert?
This much I'll say. I really enjoyed the request because so few people really give a damn about this behind the scenes stuff. But I'm really looking forward to this. It was surprising because most people, if you say Mort Weisinger, huh? Who? What? So this is going to be some really good geek out stuff for me.
Well, the initial thing would say that he was basically in charge of what people consider, even it was it's somewhat some end of the golden age, but mostly silver age Superman. But it's basically the age of wonder where he had a lot of, some famous writers and some classic comic book writers working with him on Superman. And he basically, though not the creator, he's been seen as the person really carrying the brand of Superman and the success of Superman, like post the radio show and the TV show, because he came in a little after that, but really keeping the titles going and being very much a success with the Superman titles until he left in, I think, 1970 and browbeat his friend Julie Schwartz to take over Superman, who Julie didn't want to take over Superman, but ultimately, he was a pulp guy. Like he had a pulp, I think it was a pulp. Basically, to give you the references, the stuff you should get is the Krypton Companion. You can get this. You can get what else? Like, 'cause I'm cheating a lot on this. What's this? Les Daniels, not Lee Daniels. This other Superman book. There's a couple other books out there. DC, Amazing World of DC, and there's also those Amazing World of DCs, those old books that are out there that I looked at. But basically, he was a pulp guy. He edited a bunch of pulp stories. Ultimately, one of the books was Amazing Stories that he did. He and in there he worked with a lot of. He was already friends with Julie Schwartz way back when, and at the same time he was working with writers, classic writers. One being, was it Edmund Hamilton, who the city at the city. What's the book that he wrote? Damn it, I just had it in my head. But it's a classic writer who wrote many of the classic stories. And at the same time, but Superman was rolling. Superman, DC had a hit with Superman. They'd already, before he got here, they had, I think Superboy was introduced a little around either while he got there, but or a little
Super
while. Hmm?
Superboy, I think Superboy's a few years before he gets there.
Yeah.
Superboy is like 19. Are you talking Superboy when he gets his own title, or Superboy when
Well,
he's
when he
actually
first
introduced?
introduced, like to just say that you had Superboy, you had the radio show, which had created a bunch of things like Kryptonite, and then you had the TV show. But as you said, yeah, yeah, thank you for that. At the same time, there was an editor before him, which was Whitney Ellsworth, who was doing the TV show, and he'd bring in his well, he wasn't, they weren't co-editing, but they were working together. Whitney was the lead, and Mort Weisinger was his assistant, or his one of his associates. And with the TV thing rolling, and they would work out plots. This is the crazy part, that they would work. Whitney would work out these plots for the writers for the TV show. They'd sit together with Mort Weisinger. They figure out the plots, and then they'd give it to the writers. And the TV people would say, they say it in this book, they didn't really know what they were getting, like, because the writers' room would get it from the comic guys, and then Whitney would decide, all right, I'm springboarding from comic books, I'm moving to TV. So Mort, Superman is yours. And that's where we got a lot of the classic stuff. Do you want to run down some of the stuff that was under Superboy's, Mort Weisinger's run, some of the
No,
classic?
that's a lot of stuff about
We got this book. I
West
got some stuff to back you up, so don't worry. I got a cheat sheet.
Westing Wessinger. Yeah, you know how I feel about the cheat sheet. One thing I do want to throw in, this isn't necessarily a Mort Weisinger thing, but since you're throwing up those books, I highly recommend for anyone who really wants to get a lot more in terms of a lot more info on Superman. There's the Superman Encyclopedia, and I don't know if that's been
Mhm.
updated. The last time I read it was maybe, I think the last time it was out was about 2012, and I
Mhm.
don't know if they've done any updates since then. And I'm like such a geek for Superman that I read it cover to cover. So there's a lot of great information there. There's a lot of great information there as well, and it won't necessarily give editor credit, but it's pretty easy to see what was going on throughout certain periods, like the Silver Age, which is where Mort Wessinger really gets a firm handle on those on the Superman titles. So we get Superboy. Actually, let's start with Superboy because that's where I think a lot of people would be surprised to know is the direction that comes with what more Wessinger's direction comes from. Because Superboy was originally offered to DC by Jerry Siegel in 1939, so it's the very following year after Superman, and DC or national periodicals passed on it at least three times. They passed on it at least three times, and then Superboy makes his first appearance 1945 after this is like still World War II is still going on, but after they passed on it, and this is also while Jerry Siegel is abroad, doing his bid for the war. So there's litigation and so on and so forth. But Superboy changed Superman fundamentally because now he had a career as Superboy, where you already had at least 6 years of stories where this was never mentioned whatsoever. He was young, but he never had a career. Now he did. So this is the first bit of retconning that you could say in comics at the end of the day. And when Mort Wessinger comes on, and Superboy doesn't get his own book until Superboy is introduced in 1945, but he's in Adventure Comics. More Fun Comics is his first appearance, and Superboy doesn't get his own book until 1949. And Mort Wessinger would come in there a few years later, but he paid a lot of attention to the letter columns that he would get from the kids, and they would ask questions, because the kids were very much into it. They wanted to know, okay, what's the origin? When did this happen? When did that happen? And he looked at Superman, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he thought Superman's history was a bit convoluted and a bit of a mess. And he's like, we got to he's like, he was the guy who introduced continuity into Superman. And he might be the first guy who actually introduced continuity in the comics because he was looking at it and he was saying, look, you guys, it's Lex Luthor one day, and then the next day it's Lex Laggard. Like, no, we got to keep this stuff consistent. And again, we're coming out of the pulp era where guys are just writing the stories. And they were like, okay, I'm gonna write this story, and then I'm gonna write the next story. There was not necessarily any continuity that would go on with it. And that's even with characters that were uh, well established. If you go back and look at some of the stuff with say Doc Savage and some of the stories that they had there, it was stuff that was easily contradictory from story to story. But Wessinger came in and instituted a continuity. Superman, this is Superman's story. He comes here, this happens next, career is Superboy, then he's Superman, fine. Okay. And uh, primarily this takes a stronger hold during those 4 years that don't have any age adhere to them. There's no, I would call them the atomic age, but it's that period between the golden age and the silver age.
Mhm.
And that's primarily where we get that particular focus. But that really changes things because now writers had to understand, no, you had to pay attention to what came before. This was going to be contradictory. If it was contradictory, it was not going to happen. And you had that for the Superman titles, and you had that for the Superman titles. You also had that for the Superboy titles, and of course, remember that Superboy appeared in more than one book because he appeared in Adventure Comics and he also appeared in his own book, Superboy. So this was one of the biggest things that I thought Mort Weisinger introduced for Superman, if not DC Comics, which was the whole idea of having continuity, that you couldn't just write a story and then the next story, totally contradicted it, because he was paying attention to what the kids were paying attention to. And so he definitely worked towards addressing that. A lot of the, I'm not certain, I think you touched on it with the radio program, but something else he also instituted, and I don't think this was strictly with just the Superman books, where you would see one of these crazy Silver Age covers with Superman like being overweight, looks like he's 400 pounds and he's saying something really wacky. And Weisinger instituted that he would get the guys to do the covers first.
Mhm.
And then after he got the covers done, he'd give it to the writer and say, okay, here's the cover. Get a story together based on that. I couldn't imagine any of these guys doing that today. But the whole idea was to keep these guys on their toes in terms of writing, which would also keep it on their toes in terms of pleasing their audience, which were kids. If the kids, if the kids could pretty much sort out what the ending was going to be, how interested would they be in the actual story? And so this was something that he also instituted at that point. And so the tight focus on continuity. I mean, he was a hard editor. This was like your editor's editor at the end of the day. He, you know, because he had some run. Because Jerry Siegel wrote under him, and it wasn't necessarily the best relationship at the end of the day, at least from what I've read. But even with guys like Jerry Siegel, if you look at some of the stuff that Jerry Siegel wrote for Superman during that period, because he did come back and write Superman, some real top notch stuff. Even with the death of Superman, even though that's something that was really coming down to. Even with the death of Superman, which was one of these imaginary tales, which Weisinger introduced, having these tales where these guys could flex their muscles a bit more and not have to worry about continuity. The imaginary tales, which was primarily Superman. It didn't really happen in any of the other titles, maybe a Batman here and there, but those were primarily Superman stories. But he really pushed them to flex their muscles along the day, and the introduction of continuity. And those are the two strongest contributions that he made to the Superman line. And he definitely made more, but those right there, those are the two strongest.
Yeah, well, one of the things that, well, when you were saying that, being such a strong editor and such the Superman being so successful, there's one of the anecdotes that they were talking about that I think Mort was doing some editing before the war, and then when he went to the war, Jack Schiff he took over those titles, and then when the war ended, Mort they had to keep both of them because there was so much stuff going on. Now people complain about Jack Schiff in relation to Kirby and all that stuff, but they say at DC that these guys were two really successful editors where especially Mort Weisinger, they might have wanted to make him editor in chief of like whatever the term would be, the head editor of DC, but they were worried that the other guy would quit. So they were that's why you don't see him take over, DC entirely, because they're worried about the other guy just saying, oh, this guy's my boss, I'm out of here. But they say one of the other things they had that are under his creation, or the main ones are, well, there's many main stories, but they said that DC was kind of against doing Jimmy Olsen a series and a Lois Lane series, and both of those were very successful under his watch. So he, not only brought doing Superman stories, but doing their supporting cast and getting stories out of that. And I think they showed some of the covers are straight out ripoffs of stuff that he did back in the pulp stories. Like some of those monsters that were in there were from his own pulp sort of thing. And then drawing from these people like, with Otto Binder, who's like the increase in the Superman family, and adding all those characters and Bizarro. And, you already mentioned the imaginary stories, but this really gave the thing that because we as fans and remember, we kind of edit out some of the silliness because there was a lot of silliness in there. But all these sort of creations of Supergirl that even though like Fortress of Solitude is from Doc Savage, that sort of stuff, that gave a sense of wonder, especially because comic books always draw from other periods, so it's not being anything negative. Like even to this day, people look at other things. I think I did something on the X-Men where they kind of drew from some books, so it's not strange to see them drawing from the pulps. But it's one of those things where you see him and just broadening the Superman family, even with the guy who created Captain Marvel and who already had a family. Now you see Superman just benefiting from all this stuff, having the science fiction writers, having, as you said, Jerry Siegel back there, and as they go along, they say, but I mean, as you to go into the tough editor stuff, I guess that would be the next stage of this, is that at some point, well, no, I think he really thought Superman was the most important thing, more important, even though he obviously kept himself important as an important part of it. But he really felt that Superman was the one they were serving, and they would squeeze the squeeze the everything out of these writers. They say he was also tough on Wayne Boring, who he didn't. His son said in one of those interviews that Mort Weisinger wasn't necessarily a fan of his. He was a fan more of Kurt Swan's work, even though he was so tough on Kurt Swan. Kurt Swan had like a migraine, and then when he left Superman for a while, but when he came back, he kind of pushed back on Mort, and Mort finally stopped like giving him stuff, like so. It's one of those things where he's just this tough sort of editor, and then when he get new blood that he liked Cary Bates, who sending in covers, and he'd asked him to do stories. This new blood, and then of course, same Jim Shooter would draw a whole sort of book, and he was buying these books without editing them. Whereas with all the other writers, and he did, I think he wrote a couple of Superman stories. He did write a couple of Superman stories, but he was mainly like a editor, like plotter. Like he would basically really be, hammering with these writers that he had. All were all talents, all had proven they could write comic books. But as you were saying, he was really the person who was controlling the continuity, and I would say like really is responsible for the brand of Superman, making it bigger and blowing it up even more. But you had these new blood where they're like, hey, these guys, I like their stuff. Now let me edit them, and he's hammering these guys, into the ground and making sure that they get everything right, and like playing these creators against each other. Whereas to Cary Bates, they were saying that he was telling Cary Bates that, hey, I got this kid, he's so much better than you. And then at the same to Jim Shooter, he was doing the same thing, saying, oh, Cary Bates, he doesn't have these typos like you do. Like, I think you're my charity case. And even the last, because there's an interview on, I think it's a Comic Historians with Mort Weisinger's son. He corroborates that his father was a very tough editor, and he kind of looked, didn't always look at being this comic book editor as a big thing like a lot of comic book creators did. But he confirms that he was a tough sort of person, and any story you heard was probably true. He probably said those things, and he had some stories of his father at the same time. But at the same time, he left the title, before Marvel had kind of undercut DC. So he left the title where the on sales were on top. It was really a successful sort of niche part of the comic industry. A real strong brand that he created. You know. And hold on, let me just make sure my battery's charged. But yeah, we got so much stuff from this guy, and they have a list in here. What do they have? I already said the Lois Lane and that. We have Kryptonians, Streaky. We got so much stuff. There's too much stuff here. Superman Red, Superman Blue, all of the stuff that people remember as the Age of Wonder. But they also had a lot of the silly stuff. Because I've been reading the Superman strip they posted online. They have one story where Superman gets fat, and he has to call his job as Clark Kent, saying, I need to take some vacation. So I don't take any vacation so he can go lose the weight. And it's just like there's a lot of Lois chasing him around. They had one where Superman gets
And he pushed for all that stuff.
Yeah, that's
no, he pushed for all of that.
Yeah,
A lot
yeah.
of people.
To keep for the
He said,
kids. Yeah.
Yeah, he said, well, he would go around and he would talk to kids and find out what they wanted, and that from these conversations, that's how we got the Lois Lane title. I mean, there was the prototype stories are in Showcase, but that's how we got the Lois Lane title, and that was under objection with other people saying they didn't think the characters were popular enough. I don't think you could pull that off today, Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane, but those guys had titles that ran for the better part of 20 years. Because those titles started in the 50s and then got resolved late 50s. Yeah, got resolved in the 70s. But Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, he pushed. He definitely pushed for that. He's if I remember correctly, Mort is quoted as being a Batman fan. And because he
Yeah.
was a Batman fan, he was like, well, what was the reasons he liked Batman? He's like, oh, because Batman could get hurt, which I don't really understand about the readership. But these guys are, oh, well, Batman could get hurt. I was like, come on. Do you guys ever read these stories? This dude gets clunked over the head and then gets back up like it's nothing. Especially, but I was like, okay, I guess he can get knocked out for 5 minutes, so that allows some believability. But that being said, that's where we get the red kryptonite and all these other different types of kryptonite at the end of the day. So we could throw red kryptonite or all these other types of kryptonite at Superman that allows him to be vulnerable. And now he's got to try to sort things out. He has to try to sort things out with his, using his brain, that type of stuff. Or, he can't just use his powers when it comes along to it. And then, of course, when we get Crisis, they were like, oh, it's too much kryptonite. You got to get rid of that. So we had those things. But, under his watch, was the Kryptonite, Candor, Supergirl, all of that, all of those things were under his watch. All of those things were under his watch at the end of the day. And anything that came out of Superboy at the time. So you had stuff like the Phantom Zone, the Phantom Zone Criminals, Mon-El, the Legion of Superheroes, which might be, no, I won't say that's the biggest one. I'd probably have to give that to Supergirl. But between Supergirl and the Legion of Superheroes, very big contributions to Superman overall. And the Superman that he presides over, without a doubt, is the most recognizable Superman to this date. This extremely powerful guy, barely anything can hurt him. Kryptonite, crypto, those type of things, all those things that came out of that particular era. This is still to this date the most recognizable version of Superman, in spite of it being 50 years ago.
Well, like one of the things that I wanted to bring up with so listening to some of the other interviews with I guess his son and whatnot. One of the things that they said there'd be ideas like Bizarro, right? The initial Bizarro story in like Superboy, and then the idea that his son would say is like, yeah, these writers would come up with that, and then Mort would ultimately develop and say, hey, let's bring this back, let's give him his own world, but even though they say something like the Legion of Superheroes, like Edmund Hamilton kind of did, uh, came up with it, and then you had Jerry Siegel kind of flesh it out. But it's like they still feel like, as an editor slash kind of plotter, like Mort was very much involved. And his son said, this is getting to the question to you. His son was saying that with the credits reading by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, his son kind of felt that Mort Weisinger could kind of have his name up there with them. How do you feel of having another credit with Mort Weisinger there with Superman?
I don't think Mort Weisinger himself would want it, because Mort Weisinger was an editor and he may have been the driver behind the stories, but that was never any sort of credit that I could see that he was looking for, or credit that he would probably want. In all fairness, Mort Weisinger was said to be really heavy-handed, very micromanaging. You already gave the instance of Kurt Swan, where he's like, "Look, this guy's stressing me out. I got to take a break and then come back." But he was not looking to put his name on all of that stuff, other than as an editor. And as an editor, he was trying to get the best he could out of those stories. So while he may have been the driving force behind some of it, or a lot of it, okay, I just couldn't see him saying, well, yeah, I want to put my name up on that. I think he was just happy to see that the title, when he came on to Superman was DC's number one property. And when he left, Superman was definitely DC's number one property. So I think he would just be happy to see that a lot of the stuff that he shepherded, was a steward over, is still very much resonant, and it has lasted as long as it did. It's really tough, because as an editor, for the most part, with the exception of somebody like Stan Lee, you really don't get those credits. That's the writer. The artist. Those are the guys who get that. With the exception of the time that the editor directly has his name as the writer for those stories. But that's, and this is very similar when people want, the writer comes up with the character and they're supposed to, well, this character's going to be in a movie now and I'm not getting any money for it. Well, you got paid for what you were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And Mort Weisinger, for several years, if I remember correctly, he was trying to get out of the job. He was like, look, I'm trying to get out. He kept asking for more and more money. He was like, look, I want to leave. You got to pay me double. They were like, okay, we'll pay you double. They were giving him stock options at the end of the day. So I believe Mort Weisinger was very happy with what he was doing. As long as he was doing it, he got compensated for what he was doing. And any of his contributions, I'm very certain that if he were around today, I'm very certain he would look on it like, no, that was not something he was ever looking for. That sort of credit. What I would love to see with guys like Mort Weisinger, Julie Schwartz, even I cannot remember this guy. He's an editor over at Marvel. They had this great image of him on one of the Marvel Age comics, and I can't remember his name. I think his last name begins with an R, or Dan Rosa, or any of those guys. Is more interest in these guys who were editors over these periods of time. I think, with the exception of, say, Stanley, maybe Jim Shooter.
Hmm.
With the exception of those cats, I would even say Dan Didio, but Dan Didio mostly because guys love to hate him and want to blame him for for everything. Uh, I would love to see more of an interest in that. These guys who, were stewards over the characters or over the company at this particular time, and the results they got. More of an interest in that might get you a little bit closer to, that type of recognition as an editor, as opposed to being a creator, a writer, or an artist, that sort of thing. But it's not quite there yet, which is another reason why I always give Stanley a lot of credit. I said, this is the guy who definitely bucks that particular trend in terms of middle management. Because when you're hired to be an editor, that's what you do. And you don't normally get credit. You don't normally get any credit for it other than that. There's a ton of editors who have come and gone, and we don't know who they are. But Mort Wessinger is one of these guys who you would think more people would know, would know about. And, they just don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that was, as you said, during that period was one of the most recognizable sort of periods for Superman. When you look at some of the stories that you would see reprinted with these sort of, I mean, at some point as a kid, being able to see like was it like Superman Red, Superman Blue, or the Death of Superman, and that sort of thing, where these things would pop up in the in these reprints, where these would be the classic, whether you'd look at it and say, you'd wonder like, well, okay, we have these sort of new artists like Rich Buckler and Neil Adams, and we still have Kurt Swan, who's still there. But it's like we still get these older stories that kind of still were around, that were being reprinted and being like these classic things that were part of it. And then you sort of just start to hear that as a fan, you just start hearing Mort Weisinger as one of these guys that were behind Superman. So, it's this looming shadow that never really went away. And then you kind of haven't heard about his the person before him, who obviously, being involved in the Superman TV show, that's probably was definitely a big deal. But the name we really always hear about, obviously outside of a Julie Schwartz, also is Mort Weisinger, even, a shadow even larger than Julie Schwartz. But Julie Schwartz's shadow kind of goes across of most of the rest of DC. And we think of him, oh yeah, he was also a classic Superman, but he got Batman, all of the relaunch, Silver Age relaunch of characters. So, but Mort
Yeah.
Weisinger was still that big looming shadow, and we have only a couple stories we know that. I mean, I guess the historians can pull out. I know there's some early. I think it's like Superman and like Superman 40 something. We had a story that he wrote for it. So he was involved in the Superman story for so long, and that name was just something that you'd hear at some point as a comic fan. So,
You were going to say,
hmm?
no, you dropped for a second. I didn't know if you were
No, just
about to
that
say
that
something.
name's just looming around as a comic fan, something that's just a big, large name that at some point, even as a kid, you start to hear. So the Wessinger era.
Uh, I wish, I mean, like Marvel would have, because Marvel had Marvel Age,
Hmm.
and this was something that introduced me into a lot of the background stuff that was going on. I don't really remember something that was comparable for DC, but I would read Marvel Age on a regular basis because it had previews, and I wanted to know what was coming on, what was coming up in the next in these comics. All these previews now, where some of these previews sell for all this money because, oh, this is the first preview appearance of Spider-Man in the black outfit, not for the information necessarily, but
Yep.
those are things that I had picked up, and so that gave me more of an interest in the workings of comics. When you would find out, I remember there was like this thing with this whole big storyline that was supposed to come down for Daredevil, and it never happened. And so I was like, well, I don't understand. You did this preview. Well, why didn't this happen? And I would go scouring trying to find out why didn't this story happen? And you find out, oh, well, because Denny O'Neil left, and he got a position. He got a position to do, be editor over back at DC with Batman. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess pretty much, he's gonna go back where it all started for him at the end of the day. He's like, hey, why am I gonna do Batman light with Daredevil? I can just do Batman, and I'll be the editor. Yeah, sure. So he leaves, but those type of things and finding out stuff that went on in the background and also understanding a lot of that as well. So when you read a story, it's like, oh, another origin story. Okay, somebody must be late. Somebody must be late with the art. Somebody must be
Mhm.
late. That's why we're getting this particular story, and you would get an understanding on it. So Mort Weisinger was somebody that I came into not initially from reading at that particular time, but wanting to know more. And that is something that has always surprised me with well, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. It's primarily entertainment. And then you have the guys, but with comics, there have been so many of these comic magazines that are telling you background on what's going on between Marvel Age, Comic Journal, Comic Interview, Amazing Adventures, all these different comic magazine journals at the end of the day that are trying to keep you in the know. And even today, you still have Back Issue magazine and Bronze Age, that type of stuff. You still have those magazines there, and the interest in those guys, the editors, some of the artists, some of the storylines, and some of the stories that were going on behind what contributed to the creation of certain things. The lack of interest I've always found to be very peculiar, because I can understand if there was that lack of interest and there weren't these particular magazines, periodicals to go to, but they're always there. And still, primarily it's the entertainment, and whatever discussion comes out of that particular entertainment. But I was always the person who really vibed off knowing what the inner workings were, and the decision making behind it, because that stuff always interests me as well. That's just another story. So that always interests me as well. Another thing with Wessinger, what's it? Because this is the whole Silver Age of comics. The whole Silver Age of comics that comes out of DC is what he presides over. So that's showcase number 4, where we get the new Flash and Barry Allen. But also, and this is another credit that I would have to give to him, he didn't just decide to bring in these guys and say, okay, hey, those Golden Age guys, yeah, forget about them, which is pretty much what DC wanted to do after Crisis. They were like, oh, forget all that stuff.
Mhm.
Okay, we're going this way. He didn't do that. He was like, no, we can still bring these guys. I mean, those guys got brought in. So the whole idea of multiple universes is something else that we get under Mort Weisinger. The Flash of Two Worlds, that classic storyline, the JSA still being viable, these guys coming in, for the once a year, the once a year team up. All of those things were under Mort Weisinger as well. It's just a lot of great stuff. A lot of things that's taken for granted, in terms of DC history, legend, and lore. A lot of that stuff took place under him. And again, most guys will not know who this dude is.
Yeah. And yeah, they have well, you can see a direct line to some writers going from his pulps to actually, writing novels or writing Superman, and then hitting the city at World's End and Edmund Hamilton. So you had these guys who were, not just the comic book guys under his editorialship. So this is a classic talent, and ultimately some of the roughest stories that you get when you cry, you want to cry and hear about what Stan Lee did to someone. When you get to the Mort Weisingers or Harvey Kurtzman, or even the way Bill Gaines, like the old school '50s editors are give you those classic, like the classic working under. I mean, these guys, like this was a this was a machine of getting these things out there and getting a lot of work, keeping these books on time and that sort of thing, and having these multiple stories in one issue. So this is a large undertaking, and he was expanding as he was doing it. So it was a very old school sort of workhorse type of deal, and like working these guys to death to get this stuff done. But that's the whole old factory type of deal of comics that were in play, which would be the norm, the pencil factory type of work. type of deal where your manager would give you hell and you're working in a pencil factory. So that sort of thing, which, we look at creative people and we say, well, they're creative kind of. No, he's looking at Superman. This is more important, and I'm more important. I'm the Superman, me, and then all these underlings. So, and that's not even a direct story. That's a nice version of it. The direct story is a lot rougher, yeah, that is definitely of the time of the 50s and 60s, which you'd kind of have that at any sort of workplace. But yeah, with that said, I guess is anything else you want to add, Cal's? Where you at?
Sorry. It was muted accidentally.
Okay.
Trying to
Anything
think of,
else you want to add?
there's so much. Literally could do a lot more. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, the people who were under him, I think, are also. I mean, because you have Jim Shooter, who's under
Mm-hmm.
him, who goes over to Marvel, and is definitely one of the best editors in Marvel history. Uh, you also have Julie Schwartz, but that's a whole other episode. But Julie Schwartz is also underneath Mort Weisinger. He wrote not. I mean, because he wasn't just. I mean, at one point he gave up because he originally came to do the Batman and Superman books, and he gave up the Batman stuff to focus strictly on the Superman books because that's how big the titles were and that's how important they were for DC for DC at the time. So some and in doing that, he not just wrote the comics, but he also was writing for some of the Adventures of Superman stuff as well, which I think you might have already stated. Um, I don't know, just a lot of stuff, and a lot of people came up. A lot of people came up under him as well. More people, more people than I just mentioned. He's also the guy who introduced, if I remember, I mean, with DC, he also liked putting in real people into the books as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh
So
yeah, definitely that too.
so you had people like, I mean, these are people nobody will probably remember now, but you had people like Steve Allen, Pat Boone,
Mm.
those type of people being in. JFK was in one
Yeah,
issue, of
yeah.
course. That issue where this published right around the time when he's assassinated had to be pulled, and then we get it, and then of course we get it back. Just I mean, I'll probably, I mean, this as you can see, there's a lot of stuff, and I don't want to I'm really struggling to contain myself and not go too far with it. But I'll end on this thing that this is an incredibly productive period of time for him as an editor, for Superman as a character, and for DC as a publisher. And it's just a great place to go back. A lot of people would take this idea that the Silver Age was silly, and the Silver Age was remarkably creative. Okay, this was a remarkably creative time for DC when their readership was children.
Mm-hmm.
And children are not necessarily the easiest audience to please. Adults, we're taught that, oh, we got to like read this to the end. And, then as kids don't do that. Kids are like, this looks like it's going to suck. Kids will stop on page 2 and move on to something else. So he was really good at keeping that readership with him for the duration that he expected them to be there. Uh, just a really productive time in DC history and comic book history too, because it's all part of that at the same point. So if you're really interested in Mort Weisinger, there's plenty of resources in addition to the ones that you already showed to the people. And thanks again for requesting this one. It was a lot of fun to talk about. I am going to stop right here because I could talk for another hour about this. Okay, but hey, who knows? Maybe I'll ask for a part 2.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a period where there's so many classic stories, and a lot of these classic stories have kind of been, with comic books, repeat stories, and they've appeared later in other stories, or for the post-crisis thing. So it's not like these things have been the emphasis of what it is has had a big effect on comic books afterwards. So that looming shadow wasn't just for this period. It was how Julie Schwartz still, even though Julie Schwartz lessened the sort of the Lois, chasing Superman around, that sort of thing. He kind of lessened that stuff, and because he was, I think the Julie's first thing was to get rid of kryptonite, and then at some point they just brought it back pretty quickly after that. But it's one of those things where some of his stuff would start to creep back into the stories anyway. So it's like, yeah, it's a definite that fortifying the brand of Superman, really taking that brand and making it bigger, where it's already in movies, it was on radio and on TV before he got there, and then comic wise, just fortifying the family and the characters, everything connected to Krypton, as you already said, the Phantom Zone, so much stuff added to it, Candor. So like a lot of people having to be able to do Krypton stories in the present day, which was like which they were kind of trying to do in the imaginary stories, but at the same time having Candor, you could do Krypton stories in present day, even though it was kind of like there's some story where the Superman gets turned small by this guy faking at him. Well, Lois makes him small because she mistakenly doesn't pick the imposter. She picks the real Superman, and the guy takes some tweezers and tosses the Superman in Candor. And the funniest part with me is who's that? Lois says, "So now that we're married," because she marries the imposter. "Now that we're married, you can tell me your secret identity." And he's like, and the villain's like, "Who knew Superman had a secret identity? Not to figure that out." And he tries to get Lois. Somehow he gets Lois to drive off a cliff. And then of course Superman just miraculously comes out and saves the day. So it's like some of those things with the Age of Wonder, like don't be afraid to just not just have scientific wonder, but just having something for a wide-eyed kid or the girl. Because even at the same time, the Batman books were no different, because Batman had a fiance and Julie Madsen, and in the 50s him and Robin were running away from Batman and Batgirl as best they could. Like they were definitely doing stuff for the kids, where they were just like they fall in love at the end when the world was about to explode, when they're on the alien planet, and when they save it, it's like, "You're a good kid." And, and they're like, "But you said no, I don't know. That was a different situation." So it's like, well, that Age of Wonder is in all sense of the word, not just for the science, but as far as being wide-eyed for some of the stuff. And I always like to bug out on Superman flying sideways. You always see him, he goes into the room, he's like, you see full body shots of Superman. It's like, don't mess this thing up. We want to see the brand. We want to see see that sort of thing. But classic artists like as I said, Wayne Boring, and of course Kurt Swan. So it's like you had these guys at the mainstay, keeping that. Schuster, even though when Schuster had the studio doing it, you had people that drew just like him, and then you had Wayne Boring that was that look, and then you had the Kurt Swan. There's still some licensing and such that have Kurt Swan in it. So I say all to say that's a person who really continued the brand as far as the comic books, not only the stuff that's going on in the TV and movies, but at the same time having this brand in comic books that just got bigger. So that's it for me. I'm going to sign us off. Spinner rack, unless Cal has anything else to say.
No. We got to stop it.
Out. Laters.